Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Civil Society Forum. I think we can wait for maybe 10 to 20 seconds because I still see that some participants are joining. Okay, I think that we are good at 29 participants right at this moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, especially dear fellows from the civil society organizations and think tankers, I have the honor and the great pleasure of moderating this session, which will refer to the connectivity agenda, its achievements and challenges. Being in the civil society, we probably all know that the infrastructure gap is considered one of the key obstacles for the countries in the Western Balkans to catch up economically and speed up their accession process. While there are differences among the Western Balkan countries, they usually score lower than their EU peers in a number of parameters. For example, density of the highway and railway network, access to broadband internet, intensity of electricity production, length of electricity circuit, etc. Moreover, the economic exchange with the region largely lags behind the amount of trade and investments between these countries and EU, which accounts for a significant untapped potential. And actually, it's a missed opportunity for these countries to speed up their own development. This is the rationale behind the connectivity agenda, which is in a way the linchpin of the Berlin process. According to the calculations, the initially planned investment back in 2014 of 7.7 billion euros in infrastructure projects was supposed to contribute to an increase of 1% of the region's GNP and have a positive employment effect for around 200,000 people. And now we are at the end of this first programming period, so we are going to examine what has been achieved and what lessons can be learned for the future programming period 2021-2027, where according to the Economic and Investment Plan launched by the EU last year, there should be a volume of around 20 to 30 billion euros put at the disposal of the region inter alia for infrastructure projects. Today we have with us three excellent speakers. I will start by introducing them in the way as they will take the floor for the first round of introductory remarks. We have with us Mr. Michael Vögele, who is the head of section of the WBIF, Indigeneer, the European Commission. We have with us Mr. Matej Zakonjšek, who is the director of the transport community, and also Mr. Ardian Hackaj, who is the coordinator of Tirana Connectivity Forum, and also a research director at the Cooperation and Development Institute. So let us start with Mr. Vögele. Could you please tell us a bit more about the, let's say, the broader picture of the connectivity agenda and maybe what is most visible to the general public, the investment projects? What have been the key achievements of the connectivity agenda in the past period? What lies ahead of us and what lessons have we learned until now?
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, everybody from Brussels. Thank you for the very kind introduction and summarizing already to a large extent the connectivity agenda. A warm hello also to my fellow panelists, Ardian and Matej. Let me introduce myself briefly. Michael Vögele. I am heading the team Indigeneer that deals with the Western Balkan Investment Framework. That's what WBIF stands for, and you see that also in the slide. I've brought a small presentation to you. The Western Balkans Investment Framework is one of the engines, but not the only engine when it comes to the connectivity agenda and investment projects. And what I'll just take you through very, very briefly is where do we stand and answer some of the questions that Anna has just posed to me. Now, the connectivity agenda goes back to a pledge that has been made by our Commissioner Hahn at the time in 2015 that the EU would co-finance with 1 billion euros connectivity project in the area of transport, energy, and digital in the Western Balkans. And perhaps the first achievement is that I'm pleased to tell you that with the adoption of the last package in 2020, we have fulfilled that pledge, and we have indeed allocated and committed 1 billion euros from the EU budget as co-financing to eligible projects that we have chosen under the Western Balkans investment framework upon proposal by the Western Balkan governments. And perhaps we can go already to the first slide so that you can see what we would like to achieve with that. It's quite a number of results that we would like to see. We are talking, as I said before, about energy security. We're talking about motorways, energy security also in terms of gas as a transition fuel. We're talking about different modes of transport, intermodal transport. We talk about railway lines, waterways, maritime ports, inland ports, as well as obviously also highways. Here you can see a slide which shows what we would like to achieve at the end with the projects, with the investments that we are supporting under the connectivity agenda between 2015 and 2020. I'm not going to read out everything to you. I think that's going to be boring. You can see that very easily. And I suggest to save some time, and we go already to the next slide. This is where we stand right now. And there you see that next to the 1 billion euros, we also have committed more than 120 million euros in grants for technical assistance. What does that mean? This technical assistance is there to prepare for mature investments. It would go into, for example, environmental and social impact assessments that are necessary in order to get the funding being a blending between an EU grant and a loan from an IFI or a development bank that works under the WBAF. And we also provide technical assistance in order to mature these investments. You will see there what we'd like to achieve. You see the figures, you see the jobs that we believe have already been created. But you also see that out of the 45 projects that have been approved, only 16 have started their works. 11 more will start construction in 2021, but only 3 projects will be completed in 2021. And there are a number of reasons, and perhaps we can talk about the reasons later on. But that is clearly to say, when we talk about achievements, we can't see the full achievements yet because the result is not yet there on the ground. And I think we should be very clear and honest about that. Let's go to the next slide. This is just an example to show you one of the reasons why it might take longer than perhaps somebody who is not involved in the sector might assume when we are talking about such projects as take a railway project. Obviously, this takes very long to plan, and it also takes long to implement. The information that you see on this slide here is an information that is publicly available on our website, the WBAF website, and you can clearly follow where we stand at each point in time, or I would say almost real time, with a project in terms of the various steps that are needed in order to implement a project. I would leave it here. You can find that on our website. It's just to give you an example how you can retrieve information, how you can find information, where do we stand with the projects. And there you see also on the right side, the works 100% complete when we expect these projects to be eventually fully completed. Let's move to yet the next slide, because I also want to talk a little bit about the future, because I understand that you have had already sessions today and participated in sessions also with the participation of colleagues from the European Commission. My director was there in the morning. Also another colleague was there to talk about the green agenda for the Western Balkans. Now in October 2020, the Commission has adopted an economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans. And if you want, this is the successor of the connectivity agenda, because we are not sitting idle and we simply say that that's the connectivity agenda. Let's see that these projects are being implemented. On the contrary, we now see, against the background of the COVID-19 crisis, as well as the aspirations of the Western Balkans stepping further towards joining the European Union, more has to be done. And that more is being spelled out in the Economic Investment Plan for the Western Balkans, which is a communication of the Commission. It talks about the support to the economic recovery based on a green and digital transition. And it goes very much along the lines that Anna, you mentioned before, bringing the Western Balkans closer to Europe, closing the gap, closing the economic gap, but also closing the connectivity gap there. Also creating a common regional market in the Western Balkans as a precursor to joining the EU single market. There are new elements, and I think that is important to note. And these new elements is that we are now having the green and digital transition. And we widen the scope of our engagement beyond connectivity also to areas such as the environmental sector, where we talk about renewable energy, and we talk about sustainable transport there. You see here that I mentioned already, we talk about an increased regional economic cooperation, and we have set out also a steep increase in funding for that. Now, one thing that's quite important, and I'm sure that Matej will afterwards talk about that, this is not just a funding plan. This is a blueprint also for reforms. And it's very, very clear that these investments will not bear fruit unless there are in parallel reforms in various areas that are necessary in order to bring the Western Balkans closer to the European Union. Then let's go to the next slide, just to explain to you that there are 6 investment windows under this economic and investment plan, and I already mentioned some of them. We're talking about sustainable transport, we're talking about clean energy, the digital future, we talk about environment and climate. There is also an element of private sector development, because while we have focused very much on public investments under the connectivity agenda, when we talk about reforms in the economy, it is absolutely necessary to take the private sector on board, including for investments, and not just private, but also public sector investments. And we talk obviously about human capital. There are a number of flagship projects suggested and attached to that have been drawn up in cooperation with the Western Balkan governments. And you can see these 10 flagship projects here. They are an annex to the economic and investment plan. Now, I mentioned already the green agenda. The green agenda has been actually also published together with the economic and investment plan, and that just shows also the importance that we attach to this change, this transition inside the EU, but also for our partner countries and in the Western Balkans. I think that already concludes my short presentation. I don't think there is another slide. Yes, there is one. There is one with links. Please do not watch the YouTube videos and the like yet. Stay with us in this panel. With that, I would like to end my opening remarks. Back to you, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vögele. You touched upon a very important topic that I'm hoping that Mr. Zakonjšek could further elaborate for us and illustrate in the example of the transport sector. So apparently physical infrastructure is not sufficient for our countries to be better connected. And this is an area where the pace is not very quick by the nature of the projects that are being implemented. So when can we consider that our countries are well connected, and what would be the benchmarks in the area of transport? And just before giving you the floor, I would like to kindly encourage our participants to ask questions, and there are 2 ways you can do that. We have already one question in the question and answer section, so feel free to write your questions in the Q&A, and we will take them after the first round of introductory remarks. but also you can raise your hand. So you use that tool in the lower taskbar, and we will give you the floor to ask the question or comment directly. Mr. Zakonjšek, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody, and of course, specifically to Ardian and Michael. Hello. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about connectivity. So what brings us together, what connects us? The title of the session was, it is Achievements and Challenges. And I was daring enough to add another title, which is Opportunities, because I think that this is what we also have to talk about. So allow me just to mention basically a little bit about the achievements, because we also have to, recognize when we make a progress and talk about this. So allow me just to say a few words about that. First of all, I think one of the achievements in the last year was indeed signing the Transport Community Treaty in 2017. And then, of course, that became a reality in 2019. Why is this important? Not because of its document itself, but because the region itself has recognized and dedicated themselves to really build on the transport network in the region from the policy side as well as from the network side, based on EU legislation, and to really connect the transport markets and integrate the transport markets of the Western Balkans with the EU. That is really, the shift of perception. So that dedication and, of course, the political direction is one. This, at the same time, in the last years, the region has recognized that connectivity really needs a regional approach. And that is important for the Western Balkans, but is equally important for the EU. Because of course the EU will never be connected and the transport networks will never be complete without the same networks be also completed in the Western Balkans. So this focus on the connectivity as a driver for jobs and growth and more opportunity, and of course with that, this peace and prosperity. And as Michael said, this is also what is in the heart of economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans from Commission, and this is of course our guiding principle. Again, another achievement which was happening in the COVID-19 pandemic, I want to highlight, is green lanes. So basically, within the Western Balkans, it was in the March last year, it took only 1 month for the Western Balkan regional participants, with the help of European Commission, CEFTA and TCT, to organize the transport of most essential goods throughout the region when this was needed. This happened in 1 month, and it's really a symbol of good cooperation and what can happen when everybody is looking in the same direction. Now, challenges. Exactly what you have mentioned in the beginning. One thing which is extremely important that it needs to happen in parallel is that projects and policy reforms are happening at the same time. Why is this important? Because we can have a beautiful new roads, but if we do not have a maintenance plan, if these roads are not built, or the rail or anything else are not built to the highest standards when it comes to environment, when it comes to resilience and so on, then basically we'll be able to rebuild these roads over and over again every few years. We need to start thinking of transport as a network. Most of the investments in the last 30 years went into the road networks. Now we really need to think about the other parts of the network and to really connect this, and so that we will have one transport network and not only a network of roads or anything else. Third, decarbonization. Decarbonization of transport is the top of our agenda. And here the Commission has published sustainable and smart mobility strategy for entire Europe, and we have replied to that with sustainable and smart mobility strategy for the Western Balkans. This is what has to be in the top of the agenda of everybody. Again, the challenge, borders. Green lanes is a good example of what can happen, but we need to go much further in order to reduce the waiting time at the border crossing points. So currently the citizens and especially the businesses wait too long at the borders. So this challenge of thinking globally, planning regionally, and really acting locally still need to become really the second nature. And then the opportunities to finish: investments in rail, projects as well as policy, reconnecting the capitals with intercity express train. Here, all the capitals in the region except from Tirana to Belgrade is a little bit more than 500 kilometers, about 600 kilometers. Everything else is less than 500 kilometers. This means an amazing opportunity for a rail connections between the capitals with a fast rail connection. Investment in ports and inland waterways, connected, of course, with rail and intermodal units. And of course, I think the biggest opportunity for the region is really to become the heart of the connectivity, not only within the Western Balkans, but also for Europe and between Asia and Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you for putting into perspective the policy reforms without which probably physical infrastructure would be pointless. And in that respect, civil society, given its role as watchdogs and feeding in policy recommendations in the policy process, has a role to play, although until now the connectivity agenda has been predominantly the realm of the national governments. But luckily now we have with us a spokesperson for the civil society, Ardian. So could you have been working in these issues from the perspective of civil society for a number of years. Could you tell us what would be the added value of including civil society in a more meaningful manner in the connectivity agenda? And what are the preconditions in order to be able for CSOs to be able to actually be engaged in the connectivity agenda?
Thank you very much, Anna. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here and to speak up for the person who is in charge of the infrastructure, the person who is in charge of the reforms. And now I'll talk about the beneficiaries, but I'm not in charge of the beneficiaries. But I'll talk a little bit how the citizen may see it in the Western Balkans. But first, I will start by saying that we are very happy to finally hear the European Union talk about projects, because until very lately, EU has been talking about how much money they've been pouring into the Western Balkans, but it has been unable, I mean, at least for the population, to see it on the ground. It's changing, it's all for the best. The second one, and this is mostly thanks to the project in infrastructure, the tangible ones, but also at the smaller times of waiting in the borders. The second point is that I can say that I'm in this panel with three friends. With Anna, of course, because we have been working together as well, but also with the representative of the WBAF and the representative of the transport community. It's, we notice, lastly, a very noticeable increase on the engagement and on the visibility of both infrastructure. We can see it from the trove of documents that WBAF has started during the last year to put in his website, but also by the frequent traveling that you, Matej, are doing in the region. And this is all the more welcome. And I will start with the point of, with the comparison. First of all, I will put together the IPA 3 amount of, total budget, which is around 13 billion euros for the period until 2027, and the 29 billion euros of the economic and investment plan. So basically, it's 13 billion and 29 billion. Some are the same. But the problem is that what we do not see from the point of view of the citizen in the Western Balkans is that we do not see a clear benchmark or conditions for the conditionality, for the way this 29 billion euros, 9 in grants and 20 in loans, will be awarded, or how they will be spent. And this accountability issue, it's all the more concerning for us when we realize that in front of us we have governments. The connectivity agenda is by design managed by the government, that are captured in the sense that the political will, it's not always there. This is the first thing. And the second one, when we also take into account the poor governance as expressed by the weak administrative capacity of national institutions to design, implement, and operate big projects. So basically, we have a number of significant challenges. For example, the way the infrastructure financing is done is based on merit. So, tens of billions of euros can go to certain, or are channeled to certain governments that may be, let's say, a little bit lax on certain issues of enlargement. This is on chapters, progress on chapters. This is a very important thing. The second one is that we also can see an increased presence of third actors that profit from this, let's say, lax or absence of conditionality, and from the eagerness of the local elites to bypass good governance rules in the large infrastructure projects. And this is how we can see big projects with big budgets that change in the middle of the implementations. We can see how countries are implementing hundreds of millions of euros in infrastructure projects that are not too much needed. We can see how the design is not always the best and results in changes during the project implementation and increased budget. Or the latest invention right now is special laws that allow our governments to contract without procurement huge amounts of money. So basically, coming to the question, what the CSO can do? The CSO, we want basically to disrupt the role that our elites or captured elites, political elites, and economic elites or oligarchs have on those projects. So basically, and this we believe this can become by starting to, let's say, involve or embed good governance rules and norms in infrastructure projects that our governments must apply. This can take the forms of appropriate benchmarks and monitoring mechanisms that we can be able to follow and to monitor and to, well, for the moment, signal. We want to, let's say, also use this fantastic opportunity of connectivity agenda to somehow repair the ruptured accountability, democratic accountability mechanisms. Given that it's more and more difficult to for the citizen to control our governments through the elections every 4 years, it seems that we have, whatever we vote, we keep the same leaders. Maybe it will be easier for us to have our say and to have our, to act when they spend the biggest part of the budget, which is in the infrastructure. If we can have a bigger say in all the project phases, this can be somehow compensation for the ruptured, for the damaged democratic accountability mechanisms. And finally, I would say that infrastructure is the soft belly of the EU enlargement, because regarding at least the economy, it can derail the whole conditionality mechanism as monitored by economic and reform programs components by affecting midterm macroeconomic projections, the number of projects, of the debt, that is hidden debt in Albania can be an example, for example, the 3-year budgetary plans or the structural reform agenda. So to include, we would very much like to include the infrastructure project complete cycle conditionality. We are developing clear ideas of how it can work, but maybe that awarding 100 million euro projects only on the merit of the dossier, it's okay, it should be done, otherwise the banks will not finance it, but maybe we can also add some other issues about the governance. Second, maybe we can see how we can adapt the connectivity agenda financing mechanism to increase the accountability of all the actors that are involved. And we would like to be, given that the citizens are the best partners of the EU enlargement, we would act and we will act to be the best partners of you guys in setting up monitoring mechanisms and benchmarks. Basically, from watchdogs, we want to be the owners of our own projects, and I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Ardian, very to the point, and I think that it will be actually encouraging and inspiring for all the representatives of civil society organizations to actually voice their opinion and their ideas, because I'm pretty much sure that in every one of the countries there have been certain governance issues related to infrastructure projects where civil society can actually play a role or somehow mitigate the negative effects. And we already have started to receive some questions, and I will take one which is very much in line with one of the issues that has been raised regarding corruption. It's actually a question for Mr. Vögele. Given that the Western Balkan states are all more corrupt now than they were 6 years ago, and that several have been termed as being at risk of total state capture, and also given that major infrastructure projects are a primary vehicle for money laundering and other kinds of crime and corruption, the question is twofold. Has corruption impacted the existing connectivity project in the agenda, connectivity agenda? And what is the European Commission doing to address these issues?
Thank you, Anna. Let me try to answer that question and also some of the comments that Ardian has made in terms of accountability. I think it's important to state that the projects that we are talking about, these investments, they don't fall from the sky. There is a long process of planning, of identifying the projects. And that's where I would see a clear role for civil society organizations to engage. We are indeed, and Ardian is correct, talking about capital investments, and capital investments in infrastructure means that there is a lot of money allocated it from state budgets, but it should be done so in a transparent manner. For that matter, for example, and that would be one of the answers that I can give, we would not on the EU side support projects that are not featuring on the single project pipeline or national investment plans of the beneficiaries of our Western Balkan partners concerned. These have to be planned. These have to be also foreseen in the annual budgets of our partners, because otherwise we are talking about ideas that will never see the ground. And in that, we need to get the ideas right. Excuse me. I mean, not we, but you need in the Western Balkans, you need to get the ideas right and the investments right. And I think that's a very important starting point to look at. And to influence the way these single investment pipelines are being drawn up. When we then enter from that into the choices that are being made in order to support projects, Ardian, on our side, it's very clear and that we will support projects that are of a priority also when it comes to connectivity in the EU. We have a framework there. We call it the 10T framework, which is currently in the process of being extended to the Western Balkans, i.e. it's not just identifying any road, it's identifying the most important roads, the links that Matej has mentioned before, on which we engage. And I can give you some examples. There is a very important example that will, under the connectivity agenda, actually see quite some progress. And that is the Corridor 5C in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where really a lot of construction works are going on in order to improve traveling on this more north-south line or north-south-west line. So this is an important element. Once the decision is taken that there should be an investment on any of such stretches, the next process starts, and that's the planning process. Identify, when we're talking about transport links, the right route. And there are concerns. There are concerns of citizens that are impacted. There are concerns when it comes to the environment that is impacted. There is an environmental and social impact assessment carried out, and that's mandatory for us. It's mandatory also for the IFIs that we are dealing with, and that's also an element where civil society organizations are coming in, identifying not just the right investment, but the right size of the investment, the right route of the investment. And then lastly, and that's also an important element that I would like to stress, and I'll remain on that for a moment, public procurement, public tendering procedure. We will not award any project that doesn't follow a public tender. And this public tender is being also supervised in our case, and that's an answer to the question in the chat, by the IFIs that do provide a non-objection to a tender. It is, when we talk about public funds, important that these public funds are allocated in a transparent way, and that the decision on the company or the companies involved is carried out in line with the national legislation in a transparent manner. This is where the third party is coming in, because Ardian, you mentioned third parties. As a matter of fact, I hear more criticism on us when it comes to us that we put too many conditionalities, and it is easier to go with the third partners. Now you're asking for even more conditionalities. But I'm kidding, of course, a bit, Ardian. These conditions are there for a reason, in order to also award projects for the best and adequate budget, because the risk for those practices that Juri has described in his chat increases through backroom door deals, it increases through direct agreements without a public tender. Public tenders are there to guarantee that you get best value for money. And this is, I think, what you need to, as civil society, make sure that your governments, as is the same for us inside the European Union, adhere to, not just when it comes to WBAF, but across the board, because this is where you can, obviously not everything, but you can to a large extent exclude or at least prevent or limit the risk, remedy the risk of the practices, corrupt practices that I've mentioned in the chat. And I would leave it here for the time being. Perhaps two words of clarification. When we look in the future, we are now talking about the economic investment plan for the Western Balkans, which is partially overlapping in terms of the areas with the connectivity agenda, but goes beyond, in particular with the emphasis on environment, climate change, renewable energies, which goes beyond what we have done in the connectivity agenda. When it comes to the budgets that were mentioned, these budgets still have to go to the European Parliament. We have a regulation in place where we listen for any project that we are proposing to our member states. We present it to the member states. We discuss these projects with the national IPA coordinators in your countries, and only after they have gone through the Western Balkans Investment Framework Board, they can be adopted. When it comes to the funding, this is IPA 3 funding, and you mentioned correct that the funding goes is up to 8 billion out of the 12 billion. This is not all for WBF, and it's not all for capital investments, just to avoid a misunderstanding. The 20 million that you have referred to, Ardian, that is indeed what we do also inside the European Union. This is a leveraging effect going through the private sector with guarantees. I just wanted to clarify that so that there is no misunderstanding. And back to you, Anna, on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had Gudrun Steinacker raising a hand, but also leaving a question or answer in the Q&A section. So I just wanted to make sure whether Gudrun still wants to join the discussion, or if not, I will then, yes, okay, go ahead.
Can I speak?
Yes.
Yes. I just wanted to raise a question with regard to civil society. I know that in countries which are in negotiations for EU membership, like Montenegro, which I know a little bit better as a former German ambassador there, and in Serbia, actually the government is obliged to include civil society. But the reality on the ground is very often different, and if the civil society is too critical, governments find always ways practically either to ignore them or even to exclude them. So how will the EU make sure that civil society is included and that is listened to, and that that the government cannot just ignore what civil society has to say. I think of some projects which infrastructure projects which I saw in Montenegro, which were highly questionable, and they were just, the government pushed it through, and actually the EU was not very helpful in that matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that this is a question where all three panelists can contribute and raise their ideas, but I would also encourage the other participants, if they have good ideas or questions or comments, to join our discussion. Who would like to start? How do we make the EU involve civil society? Ardian, go ahead.
I'll just start by commenting on what Michael said, that he said EU would not finance projects that do not figure in the NSPP. We know this. However, this is the problem is that EU will open up, by not doing this, you will open up to competition from third parties. And it's happening already. So basically it will be a self-inflicting wound. And the second one is that NSPP, it's not always the most representative of what the country needs. I mean, the civil society, citizens are not always heard when the NSPP is prepared. For example, in the case of Adriatic-Ionian Highway, the municipality of Shkodra in Albania didn't know until last year what was the related effect its municipality. So this is the first thing. The second one, you said that connectivity agenda projects that you always be through public tender. Well, I can quote you at least a latest example when a tender of, I don't know, around 500 million euros was allowed through a special law, was done through a special law without any open procedure, and they're becoming more and more frequent. And not only, I mean, and there are many third actors there, not only those that come from very far away. What I want to say here is that citizens are the natural allies of the European Union. And what I'm trying to point out, and what we are trying to do here, is that we find ourselves, and what Ms. Steinmacher said, in a catch-22 situation, is that we are obliged to work with the government, to work on capital investment and also on reforms. But at the same time, we are not sure that those governments represent our interests, and they have the enlargement or the integration at heart when working with the European Union. What we are asking and what we are doing is trying to make more visible our concern, because this is our money, this is European taxpayers' money. This is the first thing on how those projects should advance, but also promote our expertise, because at the end of the day, me personally, Anna, and other also colleagues that are probably following this webinar, also have worked in the civil service in different institutions, and have knowledge and input that can be very valuable for, I mean, always representing the point of view of the citizen, and in reaching the projects, increasing their quality, but also representing the citizen. We had the last example last week. Matej was in Albania, in Durrës, fantastic opening ceremony of the Center of Excellence for Maritime Affairs. It was a beautiful opportunity because we had together a publicly owned company, the Durrës Port, Transport Permanent Secretariat, university, and the think tank working together. I think more examples like this can be promoted somehow, contributing, being positive.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ardian. Mr. Zakonjšek, would you like to join this aspect about this inclusion of civil society?
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a very good question, because it's not a coincidence that connectivity agenda is very interesting for governments, because of course it's also very visible and it's very easy to explain. It's much easier to explain connectivity and transport than it is to explain things which require, let's say, more kind of policy reforms, and they're not as visible on the ground as the new, railway line or the decreased waiting at the border and so on. And that's why also I think the governments are getting better and better at communicating what they're trying to do, for, of course, obvious reasons. At the same time, we also need to make sure that civil society is equally clear in the communication when it comes to the connectivity projects, and that is not, let's say, reserved for the technicians of it only, or the engineers of it, but also people who care about how money is spent, where the different projects are designed, the impact on the local communities, environment, and so on. So, and one thing that we are promoting as the transport community, and of course that hand in hand with our European partners, European Commission, is sustainability. And sustainability with a big S. So not only environmental sustainability, but also fiscal, social, and every other aspect. And here I would really, like Ardian said, we need to use the events like the one today, just happening now, the one that was in Dures just a few days ago, to really put together everybody, and not because we need to bring together people just for the sake of the voices to be heard, but because the policymakers can also make a better choices. It is very clear, and that is the example from all other policy areas, that the best policy decisions happen when there are a lot of voices around the table, sometimes even competing, even arguing, but the best policy choices and then the projects that follow happen when that happens. So this is something that we are very much promoting within the transport community, but we are also really trying to put together not only transport, but also to build the community. So this is really in the heart of what we are doing. But the only way is really working together, be loud, be present, and of course our doors are always open, and I'm sure that I can say the same for our partners around the table.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Vögele.
Well, let me come in at the end. I think Matej has almost said it all. I think it is indeed very important to have that discussion and look at that sustainably in the way of incorporating civil society organizations. So that is very, very clear. The target is mostly the partner countries, because that's where the decisions are taken. But rest assured, we'd also be welcoming proposals that are made when it comes to the European Union, because also on our side we are spending public budgets, and we should obviously stand the same scrutiny as the governments in the Western Balkans. So that is very, very clear. I think it's a good example to have these workshops and come up with practical proposals. To say also that when it comes to the enlargement process as such, the engagement of civil society is something that is, I would say, even a mainstreaming topic that goes across, that is supported in that process through consultations. We do look very carefully at the reforms and what is happening or not happening in the countries. You know, the regular reports, but there are other fora in which we discuss with the governments under the stabilization agreements and association agreements, for example, things that go well, but also things that do not go well. Because many practices that you have mentioned, Ardian, they are not in line with the way we see these agreements with the Western Balkans. And then among partners, we need to put that on the table, and we need to name that and also provide our opinion. We do, in this context, obviously also listen to civil society organizations in order to inform our opinion. Yes, we do have delegations on the ground, that is clear. But as you pointed out, Ardian, we're not the only ones that have the expertise. And therefore, it is indeed good to listen to partners. So I'm personally looking forward to also getting proposals out of this budget, how you see critically our role in that. And I think I leave it here for the time being. Yes.
Thank you very much. This was an open call for other CSO fellow participants in this session to raise their specific recommendations if they have some. And in the meantime, I would like to make a link to one of the working groups that are happening within this CSO forum that actually Ardian was moderating just before this session. So we actually have the opportunity to provide our recommendations, to streamline them through this group and to submit them thanks to this forum and to the organizers, not only to the European Commission, but also to national authorities and to a broader range of stakeholders that are involved in the connectivity agenda. So feel free to join the discussion. We have approximately 5 minutes left during this session. And if not, to join maybe the working group on the connectivity agenda tomorrow and share also with us your insights. If we do not have any questions or comments from the audience, I would like to go back to something that Mr. Zakonjšek mentioned. You mentioned sustainability with a big S, and also referring to your area of work, which is transport. One of the highlights that is, I think, applies to all the countries in the region is actually railway. So we are all very much looking forward to seeing fast railways being deployed throughout all the capitals in the region. But as you already mentioned, there should be some policy reforms in order to encourage that, because rail, at least speaking from North Macedonia, and I believe also in other countries, is simply not a very attractive mode of transport for passengers, and even less in recent years for freight. So what would be the way to achieve this sustainability?
Thank you very much. It's an excellent question, because I truly believe that the future of transport in a lot of sense is on tracks. And this is exactly what we are really focusing, especially during this year, which is the European Year of Rail. We are really putting the rail on the agenda. And first of all, what you have also said, I cannot agree more. The transport, so the policy reforms and the projects need to go hand in hand. And here, the interesting fact is that of course, doesn't always mean completely new tracks. That in most of the cases actually means modernization of the current network. As you know, from the region, we were traveling faster as well as with the better connections 30 years ago than we travel today. So actually, if the rail tracks will be just modernized, even to the design speeds, which were designed perhaps 10, 20 years ago, the difference between the speed of a current train would go from 40 to maybe 90 kilometers per hour, which will be 2 times more than currently. So these are really the elements which are very much putting attention. And the second one is, of course, that this rail needs to be connected with other modes of transport, being on the roads or being with the ports, on the inland waterways, or of course, the ports here in Albania or in Montenegro, in order to really create the rail market. So, and of course, this is my last part, the rail market is something that the only rail market which will be sustainable, also fiscally sustainable within the Western Balkans, is the one connected to the rest of the EU. Because that is, then you get the space big enough in order to have the rail which will actually serve not only the entire region, that's only one step, but entire EU. And really, this is where, that's why the investments in rail are so important. At the same time, the policy reforms, which make sure that when the rail reforms happen and when the rail projects happen, that is connected to the neighboring countries and of course to the region as such. Now, allow me also to say that when we are looking at the rail projects in the region, why am I so confident that a lot of investments will go into the rail in the future? Because also the major financial institutions, specifically the European one, will want to invest in the projects in the region which help decarbonization. So currently, getting the pure road projects approved in the future will become increasingly hard if this road project doesn't have a clear also green agenda, such as charging stations, resilience of the network, and so on. So that's why the rail and the rail network is really something as the most decarbonized way of travel. It is where we hope, and we are already seeing that the projects will very much put pace. And if you see all the projects which are in the pipeline on the rail, in today and in coming years, I do believe that the rail network in the region will become much, much different in 5 years' time than it is now.
I really appreciate your optimism, and I think it actually provides all the participants with some encouragement that maybe we will soon be taking trains to meet for such a civil society forum. But it is also a policy area where I think that our civil society colleagues would very much like to delve more in depth in order to explore and seek for some ways to improve and provide their contribution. So I would like to thank you for this discussion, and I believe that we have a lot of food for thought that we will be taking with us from this session. And before closing the discussion, this session, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Christian Hagemann from Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft, who has a few information to share with us.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, and a brief hello also from me. Thank you all for bearing with us for this entire day of online conferencing. I do hope that it was both an interesting as well as a good experience when it comes to the technical parts of this gathering. I would like to take this opportunity to draw your attention to a special feature of our conference platform, which is the networking space that you can enter via the cafe building on our main page, and some of you might have tried it already. We use for this the tool Spatial Chat, which is actually really good. So for those of you who have already given up on these kinds of tools because they never worked so well in the past, this one clearly deserves another chance, I would say. So give it a try and see who's there, have interesting discussions, and maybe even add some points from these discussions as comments on the Future of Europe conference page we have created on the platform, in which you can enter by clicking on the plane that is flying over our conference buildings on the main square page. So the networking space will also be available tomorrow throughout the entire day. So there's also a chance to meet there then and try everything then. So for now, thank you very much for this day of fruitful discussions. Thank you to the last panel, and see you all hopefully tomorrow morning at 9:30 back here. Have a nice evening.